A small-town guy finds a lost woman in the woods. She turns out to be a millionaire escaping. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. After Jake helped Rachel escape the woods, things began to settle into an uneasy silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, but his instincts told him he had done the right thing. Rachel had disappeared into the night without a word, and now, as the days passed, her absence hung heavy in the air. It had been 3 days since their last encounter at the diner, and Jake couldn't get the memory of her strange behavior out of his mind. He kept wondering who she really was, what she was running from, and why she had come to him for help. Then, just as he was beginning to push the thoughts aside, he saw her again. The next few days felt like a whirlwind for Jake and Rachel. Jake had arranged for her to stay at a small cottage on the outskirts of town, far from the eyes of anyone who might be looking for her. It wasn't much, just a one-room cabin with a wood stove and a few pieces of mismatched furniture, but it was a safe place, at least for now. Rachel had insisted that she didn't want to be a burden, but Jake couldn't stand the idea of her staying anywhere else. He knew how dangerous her family could be, and he wasn't about to let them track her down so easily. He made it a point to visit every day, bringing her food, helping with little tasks around the cottage, and just talking with her, getting to know her more. Rachel seemed grateful, but there was always something in her eyes, something that told Jake she was still holding something back. Despite her outward calm, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand would tremble slightly when she reached for a cup or a plate. It was clear that the weight of her situation was never far from her mind. The days that followed were tense, but Jake and Rachel worked together to create a plan. They spent hours talking, strategizing, and trying to come up with a way to get her out of the reach of her powerful family. Jake had never imagined that his life in this quiet little town would take such a turn, but now, with Rachel in his life, he couldn't imagine it any other way. It was a quiet morning when Jake received a call that would change everything. He was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, when his phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something in his gut told him it was important. He picked up the phone. "Hello," he said, his voice cautious. "Is this Jake Thompson?" A woman's voice asked, smooth and businesslike. "Yeah, this is Jake." "Who's calling?" Jake replied, his heart beginning to race. "My name is Claire. I work for the Montgomery family. I have a proposal for you." Jake felt his stomach drop. The Montgomery family. He knew exactly who they were, and he knew this could not be good. "I'm listening," he said, his voice tight. "I have a proposition that might be in your best interest," Claire continued. "We want Rachel back. We know she's with you, and we want you to bring her to us. In return, we'll make sure she's well taken care of. No harm will come to her." Jake's grip on the phone tightened. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him. They thought they could just buy Rachel back, control her again, like nothing had changed. "You think I'm just going to hand her over?" Jake asked, his voice low and filled with fury. "She's not some property of yours to take back whenever you want." Claire's voice remained calm, almost condescending. "Jake, you don't understand. This is bigger than you. The Montgomery family doesn't take kindly to people who go against them. If you don't comply, things will get very difficult for you, and for Rachel." The threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. Jake's mind raced, trying to figure out how to respond. He couldn't let Rachel go back to them, not after everything they had put her through. But he also knew that taking on the Montgomery family was no small feat. "I'm not scared of you, or your family," Jake said, his voice firm. "And I'm sure as hell not going to let you take Rachel." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Claire spoke again, her tone cold. "This doesn't have to end badly, Jake. We can come to an arrangement. But if you refuse, you'll regret it." With that, she hung up the phone. Jake sat in stunned silence for a moment, the weight of the threat hanging over him. He looked across the table at Rachel, who had been sitting quietly, watching him. "What is it?" she asked, sensing his tension. "They found us," Jake said, his voice heavy. "They want you back. They're threatening me if I don't bring you to them." Rachel's face paled, and she stood up quickly, her hands trembling. "No," she whispered. "I can't go back. I won't go back to them." Jake stood up and walked over to her, taking her hands in his. "We won't let them take you," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'm not going to let them control you anymore. We're in this together, Rachel. We'll figure it out." Rachel looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear and gratitude. "But what are we going to do? They're too powerful, Jake. They always get what they want." Jake shook his head. "Not this time," he said, his voice steady. "We'll fight them, Rachel. We'll do whatever it takes." He could see the doubt in her eyes, but he also saw something else, a flicker of hope. For the first time since they'd met, Rachel seemed to believe in the possibility of escape. They spent the rest of the day discussing their options, weighing the risks, and coming up with a plan. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were ready to face whatever came their way. That night, as Jake lay awake in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Montgomery family wasn't going to stop at just threats. He could feel their eyes on them, and he knew they would do whatever it took to get Rachel back. But Jake was ready. He wasn't going to let them take her. As he drifted off to sleep, he promised himself that no matter what happened, he would protect Rachel. They had come this far together, and he wasn't going to back down now. The battle was just beginning. The days after the call from Claire felt like a time bomb ticking down, every second bringing them closer to something they couldn't control. Jake and Rachel spent their time carefully mapping out what to do next, knowing that time was running out. Rachel couldn't hide the fear in her eyes anymore, and Jake could feel the weight of their situation pressing down on him. The Montgomery family was powerful, and they weren't going to back down easily. They had already made it clear that they'd stop at nothing to get Rachel back. But Jake wasn't about to give up. He couldn't, not after everything they'd been through together. The plan was set in motion. Jake and Rachel spent the next few days preparing for what was about to come. The reality of their situation had finally hit them both, and there was no turning back now. They had made the decision to face Rachel's family head-on. They couldn't keep running forever, and if they wanted to take back control of Rachel's life, they had to act. The stakes were high, and neither of them knew exactly how things would unfold, but they both knew one thing for sure. They were in this together. Jake had called in every favor he could, reaching out to some old friends who had connections in the city, people who could help them if things turned dangerous. They had arranged to meet one of these contacts at a quiet diner on the edge of town. Rachel was hesitant, but Jake reassured her. "We're doing the right thing," he said, squeezing her hand as they made their way to the meeting. "We can't live in fear anymore." When they arrived at the diner, they were greeted by a man named Victor, a middle-aged former lawyer with connections to a few underground networks that had helped people in situations like theirs. He looked up when they entered, his sharp eyes scanning the room before locking onto them. He nodded, signaling for them to join him in a corner booth. "Jake," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're sure about this? It's not going to be easy." Jake sat down across from him, his expression hardening. "I'm sure. We can't let them control Rachel any longer." Victor nodded, glancing at Rachel. "I understand. I can help you, but you need to be prepared. The Montgomery family isn't just powerful. They'll stop at nothing to get what they want. They won't hesitate to use every trick in the book." Rachel shivered at the mention of her family's name, but Jake placed his hand on hers, giving her a reassuring squeeze. "We're ready for whatever comes. We've been through too much to back down now," he said, his voice steady. Victor leaned in, his tone becoming more serious. "Good. The first thing we need to do is get you out of here. You'll need to disappear for a while, somewhere they can't find you." Rachel nodded. She didn't want to keep hiding, but she knew it was the only way to ensure their safety. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. Victor pulled out a small map and unfolded it in front of them. "I've got a place upstate, in the mountains. It's remote, isolated. The Montgomerys won't think to look there." Jake studied the map carefully, then turned to Rachel. "What do you think?" he asked. Rachel hesitated, glancing between Victor and Jake. "I don't want to keep running, but I know you're right. We need to do this." Victor looked at both of them, his expression softening for a moment. "I'll make sure you have everything you need to stay off the grid. I can get you a new identity if necessary, and I'll arrange for a few people to help you along the way. But you have to promise me one thing. Don't trust anyone who isn't with you right now." Jake's jaw tightened as he met Victor's gaze. "We'll be careful. We know the risks." "Good," Victor said, standing up. "You'll leave tomorrow morning, and I'll make sure the rest is in place. You won't hear from me for a while, but you can contact me when you're settled." As Jake and Rachel walked out of the diner, The weight of what they were about to do settled in. They were leaving everything behind. Jake's small-town life, Rachel's past, and setting off into the unknown. It felt like they were stepping into a new chapter, but the uncertainty of it all was overwhelming. "Are you sure about this?" Rachel asked softly, her hand finding Jake's as they walked back to the truck. Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm sure. We've come this far, Rachel. There's no going back." The drive to their new destination the next day was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. As they neared the mountains, the landscape grew more rugged, the roads narrower and more isolated. It was exactly what they needed, a place where they could finally breathe, away from the eyes of the world. When they reached the cabin, hidden in the dense trees, Rachel couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. It wasn't much, just a small, wooden structure surrounded by tall pines, but it was theirs. For now, at least. Jake unloaded their things from the truck, and Rachel walked inside, taking a deep breath as she looked around. The walls were bare, the air cool and fresh. It was peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt a sense of calm wash over her. They were far away from the life they had left behind. But even in the stillness of the mountains, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Montgomerys were never far behind. She knew this wasn't over yet, and she wasn't sure what the future held. But one thing was clear, she was no longer afraid. She had Jake by her side, and together, they would face whatever came their way. The fight for her freedom was just beginning. The days in the cabin were both peaceful and tense. The tranquility of the mountains had a calming effect on Rachel, but there was always an underlying sense of fear that she couldn't shake. She kept her eyes on the window, as if waiting for a car to appear on the horizon or for someone to knock at the door. It was strange. She had spent so much of her life trapped by her family's expectations, yet now, even in this remote place, she couldn't escape the shadow they cast over her. Jake noticed it too. He saw the way Rachel would freeze whenever a car engine roared past, or when a rustle in the trees made her jump. He hated seeing her like this, but he understood. She was still trapped in her own mind, even though they had physically escaped her past. On the 6th day of their stay, Jake decided to go into town to check in with Victor and make sure everything was still set. He was gone for most of the day, and Rachel used the time to unpack more of their things and familiarize herself with the cabin. She found a small journal that had been tucked in one of the drawers. It was filled with sketches of landscapes, flowers, and random things she had seen during her travels. Rachel flipped through the pages, a slight smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She had forgotten how much she used to love drawing, back when life had been simpler and she didn't have to worry about her every move being controlled. She began sketching the view outside the window, the tall pines, the distant mountains, anything to keep her mind occupied. When Jake returned in the evening, he had a new urgency in his step. His brow was furrowed, his face more serious than usual. Rachel met him at the door, noticing the change in his demeanor immediately. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. Jake closed the door behind him and turned to her, his expression grave. "They're getting closer," he said quietly. "I just spoke to Victor. The Montgomery family has tracked us here. They've hired private investigators, and they're offering a hefty reward for anyone who finds you." Rachel felt a cold chill run down her spine. "A reward?" she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Jake nodded, his jaw clenched. "They're desperate to find you, Rachel. And they've got resources we can't compete with. We need to leave, and we need to leave now." Rachel's heart raced. Her worst fears were coming true. She had hoped they could lay low for a while, but now it seemed like there was no escape. She had spent so long hiding, and the idea of being found again was overwhelming. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake grabbed her hands, pulling her closer. "We have to go further into the mountains," he said urgently. "There's a place even more isolated than this, a cabin that no one knows about. It's off the grid, and it's our best shot at staying safe." Rachel's mind raced. She didn't want to keep running, but she knew Jake was right. They had no choice. If they stayed here, it wouldn't be long before the Montgomery family found them, and the consequences of that were too terrifying to imagine. She nodded, trying to keep her composure. "Let's go," she said, her voice steady despite the fear inside her. Jake moved quickly, packing their things, preparing to leave under the cover of darkness. He didn't want to take any chances. As he loaded the truck, Rachel stood by the window, looking out into the dark woods. The fear was still there, heavy in her chest, but there was something else too, determination. They weren't going to let the Montgomerys win. They weren't going to let them take her back. By midnight, they were on the road, driving through winding mountain roads, their headlights cutting through the darkness. The truck hummed steadily, but the air between them was thick with tension. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the trees, her mind constantly alert. She could feel the weight of the danger closing in on them, but she also felt something else, a sense of strength she hadn't known she had. Maybe it was because she wasn't alone anymore. Jake was with her, and for the first time, she didn't feel completely helpless. They reached the new cabin by early morning, a small, isolated retreat far beyond the reach of any normal road. The area was untouched, surrounded by thick woods, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was the perfect place to disappear. Jake parked the truck and turned off the engine. "We're safe here," he said softly, but his eyes were scanning the area, ever cautious. Rachel nodded, but her heart was still pounding. She had learned the hard way not to trust the calm. As they unloaded their things, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her eyes darted around, looking for anything that seemed out of place. Jake noticed her nervousness and placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "We're okay," he said. "This is the last stop. No one's going to find us here." For the first time in days, Rachel let out a breath, trying to relax. She knew they were far from out of the woods, but for now, they had bought themselves some time. As they settled into the cabin, the reality of their situation hit Rachel once again. This wasn't over. It wouldn't be over until they were free. But for the first time, Rachel felt like they might just have a chance. The days in the new cabin were quieter, but Rachel could feel the tension rising every minute. They had finally managed to put some distance between themselves and the Montgomerys, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. She spent most of her time unpacking, organizing their new life, trying to create some semblance of normalcy, but the fear still clung to her like a shadow. Jake, on the other hand, was determined to make the most of their situation. Every day, he checked in with Victor and kept an eye on the roads, making sure they weren't being followed. He wasn't going to let anyone find them again, not if he could help it. Yet, even with all the precautions, neither of them could fully relax. They both knew that the Montgomery family wouldn't give up so easily. One morning, Rachel woke up to find Jake standing by the window, his gaze focused on the horizon. She could tell by the way he stood, his posture stiff, that something was wrong. "Jake, what is it?" she asked, walking over to him. He didn't turn around right away, as if he was gathering his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost urgent. "I saw something last night," he said, his eyes narrowing as he stared out the window again. "A car, parked on the road. I don't think it was just passing by." Rachel's stomach dropped. "You think they found us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake turned to her, his expression serious. "I don't know, but we can't take any chances. We need to move, now." Rachel's heart began to race. She had been hoping for some peace, for a moment where they could finally breathe, but that hope was slipping away. The Montgomerys weren't going to let them go, not now, not ever. Jake grabbed their things quickly, packing everything into the truck with an efficiency that showed how well he had prepared for this. He didn't give Rachel much time to process. They couldn't afford to wait for the inevitable knock on the door. As they sped down the mountain roads, the weight of the situation was heavy in the air between them. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange light over the landscape, but it felt like they were running out of time. Rachel looked over at Jake, his jaw clenched as he kept his eyes on the road. She could see the strain in his face, the stress of constantly being on the move, always looking over his shoulder. "Jake," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we never get out of this? What if we're always running?" Jake's eyes flicked to hers for a moment, his expression softening, but only for a split second. "We're not running forever, Rachel," he said firmly. "We're going to find a way to end this, and when we do, you'll be free. I promise." Rachel nodded, but deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. She wasn't just running from her family. She was running from everything she had ever known, and she wasn't sure what the end of that road would look like. The truck jolted over a bumpy patch of road as they neared a small town, and Rachel realized that it had been a while since they had seen anyone else. "Where are we going now?" she asked, her voice sounding uncertain. Jake glanced over at her. I know a place, he said. A small motel outside of town. We'll lay low for a bit, figure out our next move. But we need to be careful. If they're following us, we can't let them know where we're going. As they drove into the town, Rachel noticed the quiet streets. It was early, and there weren't many people around, but she still felt exposed, as if everyone could tell they didn't belong. Jake drove through the streets, his eyes scanning for anything that seemed out of place, before pulling into the parking lot of the motel. It was a rundown place, far from luxurious, but it was enough to keep them hidden for a little while. The faded neon sign flickered above the office, and Rachel couldn't help but feel like they had just taken another step deeper into hiding. Once inside their room, Jake locked the door and checked the windows, making sure they were covered. He turned to Rachel, his face tight with worry. We're safe here for now, he said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. But we can't stay long. We need to figure out our next move. Rachel nodded but didn't speak. She knew they couldn't stay in the motel forever. This was just another temporary stop in a long line of them. As they sat down on the edge of the bed, the silence between them felt different now. They were no longer just trying to survive. They were making plans for what came next. Rachel took a deep breath and turned to Jake. You said we'd end this. What do we do now? Jake met her gaze, his eyes filled with determination. We find the truth. We expose what they've been doing to you. Once we do that, they won't be able to control you anymore. And once we have that, we can take them down. Rachel's heart raced at the thought. This was it. The moment they had been working toward. They had to take the fight to the Montgomerys, no matter the cost. The next few days were filled with tension, but also a growing sense of determination. Jake and Rachel had made a decision. They were going to confront Rachel's family, no matter the consequences. The fear of what the Montgomery family might do still loomed over them, but they both knew there was no turning back. They had come too far to let fear control their lives any longer. It was time to take back what had been stolen from Rachel, the freedom to live her own life on her own terms. Jake spent the next few days making calls, contacting Victor, and gathering any information they could find that would give them leverage against the Montgomerys. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and it would be dangerous, but they were ready. Rachel, too, felt a shift within herself. She was no longer the scared woman who had been running from her past. She was stronger now, more determined to face the truth of what had happened to her and take control of her future. One evening, after a long day of planning, Jake returned to the motel room with a grim look on his face. I've got news, he said, his voice tight. Rachel looked up, her heart skipping a beat. What is it? She asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Jake took a deep breath before answering. I spoke with Victor. We have enough to expose the Montgomerys. They've been hiding their involvement in some illegal business deals, and I found a way to tie them directly to your forced marriage and the control they had over your life. This could bring them down. Rachel's heart raced. This was it. The moment they had been working toward. The Montgomerys were powerful, but they were not invincible. So, what do we do now? She asked, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Jake walked over to her, taking her hands in his. We go public with everything we have. We show the world what they've been doing to you. Once the truth is out, they won't be able to hide anymore. Rachel nodded, feeling a sense of clarity wash over her. It wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about holding them accountable for everything they had done to her and to others like her. The next day, they set their plan in motion. With the evidence Jake had gathered, they contacted a trusted journalist who had helped expose corrupt businesses in the past. They arranged to meet in a secluded spot, away from prying eyes, to share the information and make sure it was released to the public in the right way. As they drove to the meeting, Rachel's nerves were on edge. This was the moment that would change everything, and she knew there was no going back. When they arrived, the journalist, a woman named Emily, was waiting for them. She was sharp-eyed and professional, and after a quick handshake, they got down to business. Jake and Rachel handed over the files, explaining everything they had uncovered. Emily listened carefully, her expression focused. This is big, she said, after a long pause. If this gets out, it's going to cause a scandal. But it'll also expose everything the Montgomery family has been hiding. Rachel felt a strange sense of relief as Emily began taking notes, ready to move forward with the story. The weight that had been on her shoulders for so long was beginning to lift. She was no longer the helpless woman being controlled by her family's wealth and power. She was taking her life back. The next few weeks were a blur. The story broke, and the world watched as the truth about the Montgomery family came to light. It wasn't easy. There were threats, intimidation, and attempts to discredit Rachel and Jake, but they stood firm. The evidence was undeniable, and the public outcry was overwhelming. The Montgomerys tried to fight back, but their empire began to crumble under the weight of the truth. One evening, as Jake and Rachel watched the news coverage from their new home, a small cabin they had moved into after the story had gone public, Rachel felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. It had been a long and difficult journey, but they had made it. The Montgomery family was being investigated for their illegal dealings, and the control they once had over Rachel's life was gone. Jake looked over at Rachel, his expression soft. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You're free." Rachel smiled, but it was a smile that was full of emotion. "We did it," she corrected, squeezing his hand. "I couldn't have done it without you." Jake pulled her into a hug, and for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt a sense of peace. The fear that had once ruled her life had finally been replaced with hope. She was no longer a prisoner of her past. As they stood there, holding each other, Rachel knew that the future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape. She had taken control of her own destiny, and with Jake by her side, she knew that no matter what came next, they could face it together. The battle had been hard, but the victory was sweet. And as they looked out the window at the world beyond, they knew this was only the beginning of their new life.